September of the year 9, Anno Domini. 3 of the finest legions Rome ever produced were marching through a forest corridor in northern Germania. They were battle-hardened veterans who had tested their shields across 3 continents. The most feared military machine the ancient world had ever known. On a routine deployment through the interior of a province, Rome considered pacified. 72 hours later, all 3 armies had ceased to exist. They weren't destroyed by a superior army. They weren't outmaneuvered in tactics, outmatched in training, or outnumbered. They were destroyed by something no Roman general had ever considered a real threat: mud. 18 meters of mud, rain, and a forest corridor from which there was no way out. The question is simple: how does mud kill 20,000 trained soldiers? The answer is more interesting than any battle you've ever watched. This is the story of how the terrain, the weather conditions, and a single man who understood both better than any Roman wiped out 3 entire legions in 3 days, and how that defeat redrew the borders of Europe forever. It's not the story you imagine. To understand what happened in the Teutoburg forest in September of 9th Anno Domini, you first need to understand what was destroyed there. The Roman legions weren't just soldiers. They were the culmination of centuries of tactical refinement, institutional discipline, and military engineering. Each legion consisted of roughly 5,000 men organized into cohorts, maniples, and centuries units that could reorganize in real time during a battle, responding to commands without hesitation, without debate, without fear. The training of a Roman legionary was brutal by design. Men marched 25 kilometers a day in full gear, on a regular basis. They built grid-patterned camps carved into the earth after every day of marching, complete with ditches, palisades, and watchtowers, even when there wasn't a single enemy in sight. Discipline was a reflex. The true purpose went far beyond mere individual bravery. The goal was to forge a lethal machine that operated with precision, regardless of who was in command. The 6th, 9th, and 99th Legions were far from being a bunch of rookies. They were made up of veteran combatants, men who had served in campaigns in Gaul, Pannonia, and the Balkans. Men who knew what a real battle was and had survived it. In open formation on flat ground, no force in the known world could stand against them. The Celts had tried. The Greeks had tried. Even Carthage had tried, with elephants and flanking cavalry. In an open field, the Roman formation always adapted, always regrouped, always won. The secret lay in the mechanics. The Greek phalanx was rigid, powerful from the front, vulnerable on the flanks. The Celtic charge was fierce but disorganized, devastating on the initial clash, chaotic right after. The Roman legionary system was different. It was fluid. The testudo formation locked shields in all directions under a rain of projectiles. The pilum, the heavy Roman javelin, could pierce shields and render itself useless to the enemy by bending upon impact, depriving them of weapons to throw back. And then the short gladi came into play. Weapons designed for close quarters, for fighters who moved with pinpoint coordination, not in individual duels. 3 of these legions, marching together with cavalry and auxiliary troops, represented a force of 15 to 20,000 combatants. A firepower that had broken kings, swept away entire confederations, and pushed the boundaries of the Roman world from Britannia to Egypt. In September of 9th Anno Domini, they marched into a forest in northern Germania, and they never came out. And it was exactly this perfect system that Arminius had been studying to figure out exactly where it would break down. The answer doesn't begin in the forest. It begins with a political decision in Rome, and with a man that Rome should never have trained so well. In 9 Anno Domini, Germania wasn't a fresh conquest for Rome. It was a work in progress. Roman legions had crossed the Rhine decades earlier, pushing the borders of the empire eastward, establishing outposts and forging alliances with local Germanic tribes. On paper, the region was being pacified, the favorite term of Roman administrators for the process of turning conquered peoples into tax-paying citizens. Publius Quinctilius Varus was the governor sent to complete this process. Far from fitting the profile of a frontier military commander, he acted as an administrator and politician. A man of the Roman senatorial class accustomed to governing civilized provinces, collecting taxes, and settling civil disputes. His mission in Germania focused on bureaucratic management, not on new conquests. The conquering, at least in Rome's assessment, had already been done. That was the first problem. Varus arrived in Germania with a mindset that simply didn't match the reality in front of him. He saw Germanic tribes where there were armed nations. He saw half-tamed barbarians where there were warriors who had watched Roman tactics for an entire generation and had been studying their weaknesses in silence. He saw an administrative march where he was actually walking straight into a carefully laid trap. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions were encamped in the summer of 9 Anno Domini near the Weser River. With the end of the campaign season approaching, Varus prepared the return march toward the Rhine to their winter quarters, a routine relocation that was part of the annual cycle. The column he organized was massive. Soldiers, their families, merchants, slaves, supply and baggage wagons, and pack animals. In total, it's estimated that the convoy reached 20,000 people or more, stretching for several miles down the road. But before leaving, someone came to speak with Varus. And here begins the part that history books usually skip. Someone Varus trusted completely. A Germanic officer with Roman citizenship, trained in the legions, a guest at the general's table, integrated into the inner circle of command. This man had urgent information. There was a local revolt underway to the northeast, a minor disturbance that required immediate attention. A slight detour from the standard route would be enough to suppress it. Varus believed him. And so, the greatest trap Roman military history would ever know began to close. The man who went to speak with Varus went by another name among the Germanic people he commanded. But to Rome, his name was Arminius. To understand Arminius, you need to understand the hostage system Rome used to control conquered peoples. It was elegant in its cruelty. The sons of tribal leaders were taken to Rome as children, educated in the Latin language, Roman culture, and Roman military thought, and then, as adults, returned to their tribes as representatives of imperial power. It functioned as a system of mutual guarantees. The family served as a pledge of good behavior, while the Romanized son served as an ambassador and non-commissioned officer. Arminius was the son of Segamer, leader of the Cherusci, a Germanic tribe east of the Rhine. He arrived in Rome as a child. He grew up learning Latin, studying Roman military tactics, and understanding the structure of the legions from the inside. He was trained as an officer. He commanded Germanic auxiliary troops in Roman service in Pannonia and the Balkans. He gained Roman citizenship. He reached the rank of equestrian, the equivalent of a promotion to a privileged social class. From the Roman perspective, he was a success story of the system, a Germanic man who had become Roman, one who understood Rome's military superiority and had chosen to serve it. But there was something Rome couldn't see from the inside. Arminius had never stopped being Germanic. While serving in the legions, he studied, not Rome's adversaries, he studied the Romans themselves. Every formation pattern, every tactical limitation, every condition under which the legionary machine broke down. And at the same time, back in Cherusci lands during leaves and visits, he was quietly building something. A coalition. Germanic tribes that normally hated each other, Cherusci, Bructeri, Marsi, Chatti, being convinced, one by one, to collaborate towards a single goal. The goal was to annihilate the Roman forces through a single, devastating attack. Rather than planning a direct battle, he orchestrated a fatal trap. The intelligence operation was meticulous. Arminius attended Varus's dinners. He provided the Roman governor with information that seemed reliable, which was confirmed by other sources that Arminius also controlled. He created a parallel reality, a Germania that was pacified and obedient, where any disturbance was isolated and quickly manageable. There was one problem. Someone new. Segestes, another Germanic leader and Arminius's father-in-law, went personally to Varus before the march. He looked the Roman governor in the eyes and told him there was a conspiracy, that Arminius was its leader, that the column was walking into a trap. Varus had right in front of him the only chance to save 20,000 lives. Varus ignored it. Arminius had built such a solid, consistent trust that a single warning voice wasn't enough to break it. Segestes had political and personal motivations against Arminius. It was easy to dismiss him as a rival driven by jealousy. The column set out. Arminius accompanied Varus for a stretch of the journey, then excused himself. He had to go check on something ahead. He needed to gather his auxiliary troops to help suppress the revolt. He would be back soon. He didn't come back. Or rather, he did come back, but not in the way Varus expected. Arminius didn't choose just any terrain for the trap. He knew Germania with the intimacy of someone who grew up in it, and he had the military training to understand exactly what that intimacy meant tactically. There is a specific place near Calchries where the Germanic landscape acts as a natural trap. He chose this place, and the reason why will change how you understand what happened next. The first element, the corridor, Calchries Hill, in what is now Lower Saxony, Germany. On the north side, the hill rises abruptly from the plain, a forested slope that provides natural cover for whoever occupies it. On the south side, parallel to the base of the hill and less than 100 meters away, begins the Great Bog, an expanse of muddy territory, impassable for any military column with wagons and cavalry. The corridor between the base of the hill and the edge of the bog, at its narrowest point, was approximately 18 meters wide. 18 meters. For a modern army, this would be a serious obstacle. For a first-century Roman column, with cavalry, baggage wagons, mules, and civilians, it was a straitjacket made of earth. A Roman legion's combat formation needed space. The testudo required soldiers to move in coordinated blocks, with precise distances between them to maintain the shield wall's integrity. Cavalry needed open ground to execute charges and flanking maneuvers. Light infantry used for scouting and cover needed room to fall back and regroup. In an 18-meter-wide corridor, with a hill swarming with warriors on the left and an impassable swamp on the right, none of this was possible. The second element, the firing platform. Arminius wasn't just taking advantage of a natural terrain feature. He went further. In the days and weeks before the Roman column arrived, Germanic warriors built a peat wall along the edge of the hill, a low rampart, camouflaged among the vegetation, serving both as a protective position for archers and an additional obstacle against any Roman attempt to charge up the slope and counterattack. The Germanic tribes would use the hill as a firing platform. Spears, arrows, stones, javelins, everything could be rained down on the compressed column in the corridor below. And the Romans, unable to form up properly, deploy their cavalry, flank, or advance in formation, would have to absorb this fire at a standstill. The third and most decisive element was something no Roman general could have ordered to stop. September in northern Germania brings rain, not drizzle downpours. Relentless rains that turn the region's clay-rich soil into something with the consistency of bread dough. The terrain in the corridor between Calchries and the Great Bog, when wet, became a traction trap. Feet sank. Wagon wheels buried themselves up to their axles. Horses slipped and collapsed. And the sandals of the Roman legions designed for paved roads, for the dry Mediterranean soil, became utterly useless. Arminius knew all of this, every single element. The corridor, the hill, the peat wall, the September rain, the swamp to the south. The ambush went far beyond mere opportunism. It was an integrated system of destruction, engineered by someone with intimate knowledge of both Germanic geography and the inner mechanics of the Roman legions. And when Varus's column entered that corridor, the trap began to spring shut. For now, in that first hour, the Romans didn't know it yet. The initial attacks looked exactly as they had been described. A localized problem, a tribal uprising that would be quickly put down. No one understood yet that the moment the first baggage wagons rolled into the corridor, something irreversible had occurred. Varus's troops were in marching formation, not organized for combat, a brutal tactical difference that would dictate the course of the clash. In battle formation, the Romans would arrange themselves into compact, coordinated blocks, with cavalry on the flanks and heavy infantry in the center. A marching column was entirely different. It was an endless procession of men, horses, wagons, and civilians stretched along the road, sometimes spanning 8 to 10 kilometers. The different units were separated by distances that didn't matter in open terrain, but inside a forested corridor, They became communication chasms. Early on the first day, the Germanic attacks were exactly what they seemed: skirmishes. Warriors bursting from the forest in groups, hurling javelins, and retreating before the Romans could mount a response. Vanguard officers pinpointed the directions of the attacks and ordered standard countermeasures. Cavalry dispatched to flank, heavy infantry sent to push forward and apply pressure, the very tactics that had worked dozens of times in other contexts. But then came two simultaneous problems. First, the rain. The rain, which had started light, intensified. The corridor's floor clay soil, already softened by September, began to give way under the soldiers' weight. Footsteps that should have been firm became unsteady. Soldiers trying to sprint to defensive positions slipped, and the baggage wagons, tons of supplies and equipment pulled by mules that already struggled on normal terrain, began to bury their wheels. Second, the length of the column. The vanguard was miles away from the rearguard. When attacks erupted simultaneously at multiple points along the entire length of the column, there was no way to coordinate a unified response. Each section was reacting to its own local assault, with zero intel on what was happening in other sectors, completely unable to reinforce or be reinforced. Varus ordered the column to compress telling units to push forward and close the gaps between them. It was the correct response on paper, but in the muddy forest, with jammed wagons and horses refusing to move on the unstable ground, compacting the column meant forcing more people and equipment into the same already inadequate space. And the swamp to the south guaranteed there was nowhere to expand. When night fell at the end of the first day, the Romans set up camp exactly as doctrine dictated. Trenches, palisades, watchtowers. It was standard operating procedure, executed with absolute discipline, even under extreme stress. But the camp, built in the mud right inside the corridor, lacked the utility of an open field encampment, and the Germanic warriors did not respect nightfall as a truce. The attacks continued in the dark. Darts thrown from inside the forest. Screams. The struggle to identify where the attackers were coming from. Soldiers stepping out of the perimeter to investigate and never returning. That night, in the muddy camp inside the corridor, morale began to fracture. But the worst was yet to come. 40 to 50 kilos. That is the weight a Roman legionary carried in full gear. The Larica segmentata, the armor of overlapping metal strips, weighed about 18 kilos on its own. The scutum, the characteristic rectangular shield, added another 10 to 12 kilos. Helmet, greaves, gladius, pila, personal rations, tools for building the camp. In total, 40 to 50 kilos of combat gear, designed for the environment the legionary was meant to fight in. Flat roads, open fields, Mediterranean terrain. On the second day in the Teutoburg forest, this gear became an existential burden. The metal armor, soaked by 2 consecutive nights of rain, didn't just weigh more, it channeled the cold air straight to the soldier's body. The leather-covered wooden shields, after hours of rain, were just blocks of wet wood. The leather swelled, the weight increased, and the surface that was supposed to deflect projectiles became slippery and uneven. And the pila, the heavy javelins that served as a legion's first line of offense, were rendered useless. The Roman pilum was a piece of fine engineering. The head was joined to the shaft by a connector intentionally made partially of soft iron. When the pilum struck an enemy shield, the point pierced through, the connector bent, and the heavy shaft hung from the shield, making it unusable. But this very engineering relied on being thrown with adequate speed and precision, and in the muddy terrain, with soldiers sinking with every step, the necessary throwing force simply wasn't there. The pila, when thrown, either buried themselves in the mud or fell short. And here's the detail that history books overlook. It wasn't a lack of discipline. The legionaries tried to do exactly what they had trained to do. The attempt to form the testudo, the famous tortoise formation, with shields locked above and on the sides, was the moment the Roman officers realized the system was disintegrating. The testudo required flat ground. The shields locked together because every soldier knew exactly where the man next to him was, at what angle to hold his shield, and what distance to maintain. It was a formation that relied on millimeter precision and terrain that allowed the soldiers to move in sync. in the mud on uneven ground, with soldiers of different heights sinking to different depths with every step, and with shields too heavy to hold correctly for more than a few minutes. The testudo became a fiction. The soldiers could form it for a fleeting moment, but keeping the formation moving, whether advancing or retreating, was impossible. And while the Romans struggled to hold formations that didn't work on that terrain, the Germanic warriors operated with complete freedom of movement. The Germanic tribesmen wore no heavy armor, linen garments, animal skins, nothing to anchor them to the ground. They knew every tree in the forest, every dip in the terrain where the mud was firmer, every rocky ridge that offered a stable footing for a throw. They attacked from above, from the Calcrese Hill, raining projectiles down on the tightly packed column below. They attacked from the flanks, emerging from the forest in pairs or small groups, killing 2 or 3 soldiers and pulling back before any organized response was possible. They didn't fight in formation. They didn't need to. The contrast was absolute, and it was exactly the contrast that Arminius had calculated. The Roman side, soldiers too heavy to move quickly, on terrain that shattered their ability to form up, holding weapons designed for situations that no longer existed, with a chain of command fragmented by the length of the column. The Germanic side, light, mobile warriors, striking where they chose, retreating when they pleased, racking up kills without risking a pitched battle that would destroy them. Every element of the Roman arsenal was being neutralized, one by one. The cavalry was useless in the dense forest and the muddy corridor. Horses that were decisive weapons in the open field became heavy obstacles on ground that couldn't support them. Infantry formations were impossible to maintain on uneven soil and in tight spaces. The pila were ruined by the mud and the weight of the armor. The shields were too heavy to hold in position for extended periods. The ability to flank was zero. The southern swamp guaranteed that. By the end of the second day, the Roman command structure was collapsing. Centurions died without being replaced. Orders sent from one section of the column never reached the other. Soldiers who had sworn absolute obedience began making individual decisions to survive, scattering into the woods, abandoning their baggage, searching for an exit that wasn't there. Varus, exhausted and wounded, commanded the remnants of an army that had ceased to function as one. On the morning of the third day, he made the only decision still left in his hands. He attempted what no Roman general ever accepts doing: a fleeing retreat. Not an orderly, tactical withdrawal, covering the movement with a rear guard. A retreat for pure survival, with the remnants of the column trying to force their way out of the corridor. It didn't work. The Germanic warriors had occupied the entire length of the corridor. There was no weak point. There was no opening. The pressure from Calcrese Hill on one side and the swamp on the other ensured that any mass movement was impossible. The attempted charges groups of legionaries trying to carve a path toward the Germans blocking their exit route dissolved in the mud before even making contact. The senior officers died that morning. One by one, the military tribunes and legates who were still standing were eliminated. The structure that made a legion, the chain of command that transformed 5,000 men into a single collective will, vanished. Publius Quinctilius Varus understood what had happened. There is no record of his final words. What we do know, from the accounts of Cassius Dio and Tacitus written decades later, is that Varus made the choice Roman generals made when defeat was total. He committed suicide. He preferred death over being captured, paraded in a Germanic triumph, or enslaved. With Varus dead, what remained of legions 17th, 18th, and 19th ceased to exist as an organized force. What followed was methodical and systematic. The Germanic warriors, freed from the need to coordinate an attack against a still resisting force, swept through the corridor from end to end. Soldiers trying to surrender were killed. Those who fled into the forest were hunted down. A tiny fraction managed to reach the Roman garrisons near the Rhine. These survivors brought the first news of the disaster. The civilians and non-combatants who had accompanied the column soldiers' families, merchants, slaves were mostly captured. Some were sacrificed in Germanic religious rituals. Others were integrated as slaves into tribal communities. In 72 hours, between the hills of Calcrese and the edges of the Great Swamp, 3 Roman legions had been wiped out, Approximately 15 to 20,000 people had died or been captured. The greatest military disaster Rome had suffered in centuries. When the news reached Rome, it arrived in a silence that ancient historians describe as shocking. Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, was 62 years old in September of 9th Anno Domini. He had spent decades building a political system that transformed the Republic into an empire, stabilizing a world that had bled through civil war for an entire generation. He was a cold calculator, a patient strategist, a man who had survived the assassination of Julius Caesar, the defeat of Mark Antony, the collapse of the Republic. When the news of Teutoburg reached Rome, Suetonius recounts, Augustus was left in a state of absolute shock. Varus, give me back my legions. That is what Suetonius records Augustus exclaiming, repeatedly, in the months following the defeat, banging his head against the palace walls, refusing to cut his hair or beard as a sign of mourning. The phrase became famous, but what it reveals about the magnitude of what had happened is far more important than the drama of the scene. 3 entire legions. Rome had lost battles before. It had lost generals. It had lost cities and provinces and reconquered them. But there was something different about losing legions 17th, 18, and 99. The impact went far beyond the sheer numerical scale of the massacre, even though 15 to 20,000 casualties represented an absolute disaster by any metric. The attitude Rome adopted next is what truly exposes the severity of the wound. Throughout the history of the Roman army, legions were given permanent numbers. When a legion was destroyed or disbanded, its number was typically reused for a new unit. It was a symbolic continuity. The numbers lived on even when the men who carried them were no longer there. With legions 17, 18, and 19, Rome broke this tradition for the only time in its history. The numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never reused. Never. In all the centuries that followed, as the Roman Empire continued to exist, raising new legions, recreating old ones, the 3 numbers of Teutoburg remained empty. There was no Legion 17th. There was no Legion 18th. There was no Legion 99. It was as if Roman history had consciously chosen to keep those blank spaces as a permanent scar, a reminder of what had happened in a forest corridor in northern Germania. But the most profound consequence of Teutoburg wasn't symbolic. It was geographic. Before September of 9th Anno Domini, the Roman imperial project in Germania was clear. Keep advancing east, incorporate the Germanic lands up to the Elbe River, and eventually to the Danube, creating a shorter and more defensible border. It had been decades of campaigns, of building roads, of establishing Roman cities deep inside Germanic territory. After Teutoburg, Augustus made a decision that his successors followed for centuries. The Rhine was the border. Rome would not conquer Germania. Not because it was militarily impossible in the following years. Roman generals returned to Germania and won battles against the very same warriors who had destroyed Varus. But the political and human cost of a lasting conquest, in a terrain that had proven to be the ally of the Germans and the enemy of the Romans, was considered far too high. The Rhine-Danube frontier became permanent, and that decision made by an emperor banging his head against a wall and screaming the name of a dead general altered the cultural, linguistic, and political makeup of what would become modern Europe. The line between the regions that were once Rome and the regions that remained Germanic traces with surprising precision, the boundary between Romance and Germanic languages on today's linguistic map. It's the difference between French and German, between northern Italy and Austria, between the Romanized Europe and the Europe that never was. Teutoburg wasn't just a battle. It was the moment the shape of Europe was set. You already know the story. Now comes what the story doesn't explain by itself. The exact mechanics of why mud kills 20,000 trained soldiers. And this is where the answer changes how you think about war. To understand why the mud was a more efficient killer than any Germanic army would have been out in the open, you have to think about weight and surface area. A Roman legionary in full armor weighed between 200 and 220 pounds with all his gear. His sandals, designed for paved Roman roads, distributed this weight over a relatively small contact area. On solid ground, this was irrelevant. On waterlogged clay soil, with the consistency of soft mud. It meant that with every step, the soldier was essentially trying to walk on a surface that gave way. Imagine trying to run on a very wet, sandy beach carrying 100 pounds on your back. Every step sinks. Every time you pull your foot out of the hole, you expend energy. It's not an occasional effort. It's every step, continuously, for hours. The mathematics of Roman legion formations had built-in assumptions. For the legionary phalanx to work, soldiers had to maintain specific distances, roughly 3 feet between each man in the rank and 3 feet deep between ranks. These numbers weren't arbitrary. They were calculated to allow the soldier to move his shield, use his gladius in the space beside him, and step back 2 paces without colliding with the rank behind him. In a 60-foot wide corridor, with slippery mud, with soldiers sinking to different depths depending on the type of soil under their feet, these spacings became impossible to maintain. The formation that had defeated Pyrrhus, Carthage, and the Gauls required reliable footing and enough space to execute the movements for which it had been trained. Neither existed at Teutoburg. And then there was the psychological component. Armies don't just run on muscle and steel. They run on certainty. The Roman legionary, for centuries, had been trained with the conviction that the formation was invincible, that as long as he held his place, kept his shield up, and executed the movements he had practiced thousands of times, he would survive. It was a psychology of systematic trust that made individual men extraordinarily effective as a collective unit. In the Teutoburg forest, that certainty was systematically destroyed. The enemy wasn't visible. They came from above, from below, from both sides, from any direction, at any time. The attack stopped without warning and restarted with no detectable pattern. A soldier in the ranks would see the man next to him get hit by a javelin that came from somewhere in the forest, but couldn't pinpoint where. The formations that had been their guarantee of survival became the very reason they were sitting ducks, a dense mass of slow, predictable, and highly visible men in a terrain where the enemy was invisible and fast. Compare that to the Germanic warriors. Linen instead of iron. Sandals or bare feet adapted to the terrain they had known since childhood. No formation to hold, no precise distances to maintain, no weight anchoring them down. They attacked, fell back, rested, ate, and slept in secure positions on the hills or in the woods. In 2 days, while the Roman legionaries drained their physical and psychological reserves in a constant struggle to maintain an impossible tactical cohesion, the Germanic warriors remained fresh enough for the 3rd day. What Arminius understood, with the clarity of someone who had studied the Romans from the inside, was a truth that the Romans themselves had never had to face. Military superiority is not absolute, it's contextual, it depends on conditions. It depends on, and when those conditions are removed, when the flat ground vanishes, when the room to maneuver disappears, when the weight of the armor that protects you in open battle starts to immobilize you in close quarters, the best trained army in the world becomes a heavy, slow, and confused mob. The environment, weaponized deliberately, can nullify any advantage in training, numbers, or equipment. The answer to the question we started this video with is this: the mud didn't kill the soldiers directly. It destroyed the system that made them invincible. The lesson of Teutoburg didn't die in 9 Anno Domini. It resurfaced at Hattin in 1187, when Saladin cut the Crusader army off from water and destroyed the most important Christian force in the medieval Middle East without even needing an open field battle. It resurfaced at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, when the Viet Minh used the valley's topography to isolate and destroy one of France's finest military forces, turning their own elevated positions into firing platforms that the French, stuck at the bottom of the valley, couldn't effectively counterattack. In every guerrilla war fought in mountainous or forested terrain, technologically superior forces have found themselves unable to translate their gear into victories against enemies who understood the ground better than they did. The principle Arminius applied in the Teutoburg forest is what military scholars call an environmental force multiplier. Terrain doesn't fight. Terrain simply imposes conditions. And when those conditions favor one side while crippling the capabilities of the other, the terrain becomes more decisive than any number of extra troops or any superior weapon. Military academies still study Teutoburg, not because the tactical principles transfer directly to a world of drones and GPS-guided munitions, but because the core principle remains. Terrain intelligence is an advantage that cannot be offset by superior equipment. A commander who knows the ground better than their adversary holds an edge that training and technology cannot erase. In that decision lies one of the most influential geopolitical choices in human history. The Europe we know today, with its languages, its nations, its cultures, is the legacy of an 18-meter corridor of mud and calcareous in the year 9 Anno Domini. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel exists to tell stories like this, where the outcome of a battle wasn't inevitable, where a single environmental or tactical factor changed the trajectory of a civilization. Drop a like. Stories like this deserve to be shared. Subscribe. Our next video dives straight into another time terrain decided a war. See you then.